mute ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
Good morning, folks. Welcome to VISTA 2025 online. My name is David Howe. I'm at Western University in Canada, and you are tuned in to the social cultural panel. And today we have an interesting panel. Each speaker will speak for 20 to 25 minutes. If you attended the technology session yesterday, you will be aware that there's a Q&A tab at the top where you can ask questions. And hopefully as we go along, I will be able to answer some of the questions. And we will have space at the end for discussions with the panelists, and I will read out the questions that I haven't answered and so on. So that's really the agenda today. So as way of introduction, for those of you who may not be familiar with the social cultural area of parasport, the scholarship that is undertaken in simple terms is broadly really interested in telling stories. And these stories are designed to elicit emotions, to make listeners and or readers reflect upon their practice in and around parasport, disability sport, and throughout society more generally. Stories may take the forms of life narratives, creative nonfictions, or ethnographic vignettes, to name but a few. Today's session is shaped around the particular kinds of stories that the three individuals who will speak have lived and experienced in the Paralympic Games. The bios of our three speakers can be found in the link where you signed up for this session. The reason I put this collection of individuals together is because there is a tension that exists within the contemporary Paralympic Games with the inclusion of people who need support when they engage in its practice. Our first speaker is Dr. Amanda Lowry, who considers themselves to be a highly impaired athlete. Stacey Manella uses a guide when engaging in her sport of alpine skiing. And last but by no means least, Dr. Andrea Bunden was a guide at 2 Winter Paralympic Games in the sport of Nordic skiing. This session is about them telling their stories. At the heart of these tales is the issue of dependency. The requirement for assistance to engage in parasport is something that needs our attention. National Paralympic committees often try to limit support staff, citing a lack of available accreditation provided by the IPC for important teammates to gain access to the Paralympic Village. One has to wonder whether this is not really a move to save money and over time streamline what is acceptable for a Paralympian to look like. Ultimately, we need to be mindful that dependency is a continuum, and we all need one another from time to time. The stories in this session will illuminate many of the important issues surrounding the requirements for equitable treatment of athletes that need support in order to compete at the Games. So I'm going to be quiet in the background now, and I'm going to hand over to Amanda for her story to begin the session.
Kia ora koutou, which is welcome to you all in Māori. My name is Amanda Lowry. I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I've just finished a PhD exploring the embodied experiences of welfare and care for athletes with high levels of impairment in high-performance disability sport. In this research, I draw heavily on a lineage of critical disability and feminist theorists whose work centers on lived experience and exposes how power moves through bodies, institutions, and time. With this work, I aim to open up new possibilities of imagining, narrating, and doing disability otherwise. In 2013, no, it didn't work. Sorry, guys, screen didn't change. Give me a second. Sorry, folks. Got a little bit of a glitch here. Okay. In 2013, I dived off my surfboard without my hands up. I hit the bottom and I broke my neck 6 days after the birth of my littlest baby Ziggy, a sister for 3-year-old Lola. I suffered 110% anterior dislocation, with C6 coming to rest in front of C7. With a medical diagnosis of tetraplegia, as you can imagine, that turned my world and my family's world upside down. I'd always been super active. and that didn't change after my accident. I did everything I could to figure out the edges of this crazy new body, playing both wheelchair rugby and swimming. Both offered high performance pathways, but I chose swimming. So Paralympics New Zealand got super excited because it turns out there'd never been an athlete with my level of impairment ever swim for New Zealand. And every time I swam was a national record. I was classified as an S2, and early times placed me top 10 in the world. But while they welcomed me, problematically they didn't know what to do with me, as they'd never had to support anyone with my level of impairment. And as a result, I'd often miss breakfast or I'd be late for presentation because my care needs and venue accessibility weren't factored into training camps or travel. And this put a huge amount of pressure on me and my support workers. But these experiences fired me up and became the catalyst for my research. So my experiences exposed the paradox at the heart of disability sport. Disability sport, as our illustrious leader David Howe espouses, is held up as a beacon of inclusion, yet its very structures privilege the autonomous, high-functioning, super-crip athlete ideal. And athletes with high support needs, whose participation depends on care, interdependence, and time, sit at the very edges of that model. They are, like me, in many ways, its antithesis. Mm, sorry, guys. Mm, give me a second. Something's. Mm. So today I argue that organisations like the IPC and national high performance systems more broadly will continue to fail athletes with high support needs until they understand that for these athletes, welfare and care are inseparable. In this presentation, I'll briefly acknowledge the methodology and the gaps in the literature, and I'll bring to light the findings of my research, highlighting how the support from families, friends, and support workers provide essential assistance with daily living and sport-specific demands. I introduce the concepts of crip time and care time and how they clash with the rigid schedules of elite sport. And finally, I highlight how the ableist, structural, and cultural barriers in high performance sport that privilege autonomy and efficiency marginalize those whose participation is grounded on interdependence. So, by making visible the embodied experiences of support, this presentation argues that care is not peripheral to parasport, but central to equitable inclusion. In order to understand the embodied experiences of welfare and care of athletes in high performance sport, I draw on a fluid and flexible approaches of CRIP epistemology and CRIP methodology. I used a multi-method qualitative approach combining autoethnography, visual ethnography, pūrākau, which is Māori storytelling, and semi-structured interviews. I interviewed 19 people, 10 athletes, representing different parasports, 4 coaches, 2 carers, and 3 organisational representatives. The research was spatially scaled, which meant starting from my experience as a high performance athlete out to other disabled athletes, and then finally explored the sporting and health institution in which athletes are immersed. So while the body has garnered increasing attention in the literature, there's been a reluctance to engage with disability and the complexities of impairment. And as a result, contemporary disability sports discourse tends to theorize about the body rather than from it. And this produces sanitized, ableist research in which only some disabled bodies are deemed acceptable and some disabling experiences worthy of sociocultural analysis. Unfortunately, this pattern is mirrored system wide across global sporting practice. For example, while the IPC's 2019 to 2022 strategic plan promised to encourage worldwide parasport participation, especially for athletes with high support needs, the opposite occurred. At the 2020 Tokyo Paralympics, due to COVID restrictions on delegation numbers, carers and support workers were not recognised as essential, forcing the withdrawal of athletes with high support needs. At the following 2024 Paris Olympics, the swimming events for the most impaired S1 and S2 swimmers, who already face fewer competitive opportunities, were removed. And in contrast, no individual medley events were cut for athletes with the least severe impairments. But these moves were justified by officials to make the Games more media friendly and commercially streamlined, directly contradicting the fundamental inclusive principles of Paralympics. Thus, while para athletes are publicly included, the systems and structures that govern their participation and support their welfare failed to support their private embodied realities. But it was only when I began reading the disability sport literature I realized that so little was known about the experiences and perspectives of bodies that need bodies, of athletes who actually need and receive care. There's been so much research done on para athletes and for para athletes, but very little from them, particularly those most marginalized in sport. And until my research, there's been no research centered on athletes with high support needs, nor care in the context of disability sport. So, drawing on my own experiences and those of other athletes and support workers, what emerges is a vivid and sometimes confronting picture of what care looks like in high performance disability sport. For athletes with high support needs, care looks and feels different to the relational and highly sanitized approaches embedded in either organizational policy or theoretical discourse around coaching. It's intimate, it's embodied, and it's constant. And it includes tasks like assisted bowel and bladder care, dressing and transferring of what we refer to as cares, often managed in inaccessible training and competition environments. So the process of cares doesn't happen alone for athletes with the highest levels of impairment. Interdependence with support workers is a vital aspect of athletes' everyday lives and their sporting lives. So support worker Sue's discussed how they often end up with one accessible bathroom for a team of 8 and the issues they face scheduling and managing cares. And she said, 4 of the guys who do need my help, they work it out when they want to do toilet routines. Say we're on a tournament for a week, they'll tell me, and if they need me that night or the next morning. But there's been times where people are going at the same time. You know, we've got people who don't need help, but we've only got one accessible bathroom for the whole team. But highly impaired bodies do not always respond to the clock, and at times functioning unpredictably or at a slower pace than the norm, making crip time a key consideration of the scheduling. She described her experience supporting a team at an international tournament in Japan. In Japan, because of all the gadgets around the toilets, the commodes didn't fit over. So I had 2 guys side by side in a bathroom over buckets at the same time. One of them was like, "Ah, yeah, chuck me in there too. And I said, I don't think you'll want that. And they were laughing and saying, we don't care. Come on in, pull up a bucket. So for me, that was quite easy because I was just going back and forth between the two of them. But anything that could have gone wrong went wrong. We had blown hemorrhoids and blood everywhere. It was just me jumping between two people. We were lucky we made it to the game on time. So, athletes use humor to reconstruct vulnerability as its binary opposite, autonomy. In this example, bodily waste becomes a positive signifier, while a politics of knowledge renders leaky, messy bodies as negative and untrustworthy. This research shows that highly impaired athletes embrace their messy bodies, generating a powerful sense of belonging, identity, and resistance. Impairment is not something that you have, it is something that you are. So, despite the amount of support that athletes require, the carers acknowledge how important it is for their labour to remain invisible so that athletes experience a sense of sovereignty and autonomy over their bodies and their lives. Layla said, a lot of people do find that really good balance. For example, one of the guys usually dresses himself every day when he's at home, but when it comes to game time and tournament, so he's not using up all of his energy dressing himself, he asks for assistance. So I think they can find a really good balance themselves. You just have to wait to be told what to do or asked what to do because you don't want to interfere. So thus what must be acknowledged in disability sport is the interdependence that these athletes have with support workers is a constant defining feature of life. And with these examples alone, you begin to understand how for these athletes and support workers, the highly relational focus of broader care theory does not capture the complexity and the necessity of care and how it is intensified with participation in sport. The workload for support workers only increases when competition begins, William explained. They're up first thing in the morning doing bowel cares and showers, then supporting the whole team at the court. They're strapping us up and they're helping with transfers. They're getting food and water, emptying catheters, sometimes changing them. And when we come back to the accommodation, it doesn't stop. There's dinner and then maybe cares, and then they've got to help some of us get into bed. Support workers and athletes live and breathe crip time. Crip time is non-linear, unpredictable, and often inconvenient. Crip time bends time, and care time means living with the constant uncertainty, as the need for care is not always predictable or organized. Locating care within a sporting context deepens how we understand the physical, relational, and emotional labor that sits at the heart of care work. It exposes the constant code switching between crip time and able time, the bodily attunement, the personal sacrifice, and self erasure required of support workers to keep athletes training, competing, and surviving. Yet their relationships form powerful ecosystems of belonging and resistance. Support worker Suze talked about her work. She said, I definitely love it. I so look forward to it. You get there, and even though you're working really hard, and some parts are quite exhausting, especially the 1 a.m. call-outs, but otherwise the whole time, it's just such an enjoyable environment to be around. You just become part of their life, don't you? If you see someone 24/7, you definitely get really close. In the face of institutional neglect, athletes and carers generate alternative ways of knowing, moving, and being, both on and off the court or the field, for both parties. When we really look at what support workers do, care time becomes more than an individual juggling act. It illuminates the tension between the needs of bodies and the demands of sport. And these moments of tension aren't rare or peripheral, they're central to the lived realities of athletes with high support needs and the people who support them. Athletes with high support needs bodies do not bend to the stopwatch, and support workers are often forced to deliver care on time in a system that affords no time for care. So, problematically, the symptoms associated with cares gone wrong can be life-threatening, and if not properly managed, for athletes with spinal injuries above T6, autonomic dysreflexia, or AD, is a common occurrence. It's a sympathetic nervous system response to pain that raises blood pressure to dangerous levels. Athlete Ben explains what happens when he experiences AD because of a catheter blockage. You have to know your body. I know how a catheter works, and I know I can talk anyone through how to change it. I'm not going to wait for an ambulance to turn up to take me to hospital. It's something that can kill you. We can have a heart attack or a stroke. Ben spoke about some of the things that he and his teammates do about blocked catheters when they're without support workers. They've gotten hotel cleaners and strangers to change the catheters for them, and in the worst case scenario, I've had to suck my catheter until I got a mouthful of piss to unblock it. I was home alone and I went, fuck it. I'm a mongrel. I'm a fucking mongrel. And I was like, Ben, you're alive, my friend. You're alive. So while support workers make it possible for athletes to navigate the demands of crip time, they're affected by its pressures that intensify with severe impairment effects like dysreflexia, which demand immediate skilled intervention. Support worker Sue spoke openly about the personal cost and the weight of responsibility she carries caring for the team. She said, "You can't sleep because you get it in your head that someone could be calling out. And if I hear a knock, I'm like, oh, was it the door? Someone needing me? Every time I go away, I get called in the middle of the night, at least every second night, mostly for blocked catheters. They tend to try and fix it themselves until they get stuck. They don't want to wake me up because, it's 1 a.m. But then it gets to the point where they're like full on dysreflexic. And then I'm in panic mode and the adrenaline is through the roof. So, leading up to the Paralympics, the consequences of neglecting care for an elite wheelchair rugby player became tragically clear. Her teammate William describes the situation. Marama had sepsis. She had her leg amputated. She was pretty much dead. She's been sitting on it for years, and we've all known about it. Pressure areas are serious, and we're travelling around the world. There should be someone in our organisation doing a bill of health and making sure that players haven't got issues going on. The team are a unit, and when things go wrong for one of us, it has an impact on all of us. And Manama said she knew the pressure sore was there, but she ignored it because they had competitions coming up and she didn't want to miss training. But in her words, my body was hurting. Just everything was hurting. So high performance disability sport doesn't just reflect everyday ableism, it trains athletes to internalize it, compelling them to discipline themselves and each other to conform to able bodied norms. For athletes with high support needs like Marama, there is a disproportionately higher cost of playing hurt. So problematically, the situation is intensified with the global shift towards parasport integration, as many integrated NSOs lack disability-specific expertise required to support athletes with high support needs. So as you'll be familiar, most sporting organisations have a duty of care commitments to protect athlete welfare. So duty of care appears in policy documents, mission statements, and ethical guidelines. The widely embraced notion of duty of care is grounded on the general principles of doing no harm, fostering an open dialogue, meeting athletes' needs where appropriate. Yet, in reference to para athletes, governing bodies, coach educators, and coaches, they're offered very little academic guidance on how to practically implement care, particularly in relation to impairment. So, for athletes with high support needs, when care is undervalued, under resourced, and not understood, it directly undermines their welfare and increases the very real risk of bodily harm. So I'm sure you're all aware para athletes do not arrive at high performance sport on equal footing. Their experiences are heavily shaped by national approaches to funding, expertise, and athlete support. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, disability sport provision is fractured, largely delivered through not-for-profit organisations, often reliant on volunteers and inconsistent resourcing. So last year, following a national wheelchair rugby tournament, an athlete died from complications associated with autonomic dysreflexia. He was 37 years old, and his death was avoidable. And what troubles me is not only this tragedy, but the systems that made it possible. So, how many highly impaired athletes around the world rely on informal knowledge to keep them safe? How many sporting organisations have no formalised duty of care protocols? Since his death, our local disability sports provider has been implementing a formal duty of care process. This process requires that athletes document their impairments, their medical risks, their support needs, so coaches, managers, and athletes can collectively support and protect athlete welfare and well-being. But bottom-up change is not enough. Athletes' safety should not depend on geography, luck, or the capacity of local organisations to act. The IPC is uniquely positioned to drive international change. If duty of care requirements were mandated within national high performance disability sports systems by the IPC, those expectations would filter through to national sporting systems, regional organisations, teams, and coaches. And highly impaired athletes around the world would have greater protection because care would become a system requirement and not an individual responsibility. When care itself becomes unspeakable, so too do the people who require it. Their inclusion remains conditional and it remains fragile. Even the use of the terms impairment effects and cares tidy away and mask the actual participants' bodily activities. Words like catheters, pressure sores, urinating, and bowel care are absent from the literature because these words they threaten to spill, to soil, and mess up the more ordered and palatable sport and disability studies. But perhaps more poignantly, they reflect the broader knowledge system in which disability is overlooked or ignored. This silence has material consequences where the absence of explicit conversations around care, risk, and bodily vulnerability leaves these athletes unprotected within high performance sports systems. It is not equitable and it is not fair. What this research shows is that high performance disability sport doesn't just mirror society, it reproduces it. While high performance sporting organisations publicly commit to athlete welfare and well-being, these programs are built around a narrow idea of what an athlete is. Furthermore, despite their critical role, support workers remain invisible in both the literature and in sporting systems built on able-bodied assumptions. This research argues that until their labour is recognised, resourced, and valued in high performance sport, meaningful inclusion will not occur. So, disability sport in both research and practice can either reinforce structural ableism or help dismantle it. Talking about para athletes' experiences of impairment and care at the highest level is not just about raising awareness, it's a way to drive real systemic change. And this is not simply a matter of representation, it's a matter of justice. To make this shift, global and national disability sporting organisations, disabled athletes, carers, coaches, alongside researchers, must engage in critical dialogue, designing and leading this transformation. Without it, inclusion remains an aspiration and welfare an empty promise. From this standpoint, the IPC can embed the lived realities of athletes with high support needs into policy and practice, and they can bring duty of care to life. In doing so, they will protect not only athlete welfare, but they will save lives. It's only through recognizing the most marginalized and silenced athletes can these organizations begin to realize their vision of an inclusive world through parasport and move towards a genuinely equitable sporting future. Thank you. Ngā mihi. That's
Thank you
me.
very much, Amanda. Um, uh, just a reminder to everyone that we will that there's room in the question and answer tab to leave questions that we will address in the period following all three speakers. I now turn the floor over to Stacy.
Okay. Sorry. There we go. Are you able to see my slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. I similarly am going to talk about care in the parasport space. But first, I would love to start by inviting you all to close your eyes. And I know that's a little bit ironic since I am a blind person, but stick with me. Close your eyes and picture yourself standing in the start of a ski race. So you might feel the weight of your skis underneath you. You might grasp onto your poles, plant them over the start wand, and look out over the horizon. Everything is blurry. You see the white of the snow, but you can't see any of the features, what the snow is going to feel like. You can't see any of the drop-offs. You might see a few flashes of color from some of the gates that are set, but when you look out into the horizon, it's just blurry. You wait for the cue. Racer ready, go. And you see a flash of color come in front of you. You know that's your guide, and you know you need to push out. You listen for her cue, switch, you respond, good, and you fall into a rhythm. Switch, good, switch, good, switch, good. Now you're coming up on the first pitch. You hear her cue, and even though you can't see over the pitch, you know you need to throw your body forward. You know you need to trust her. You make it to the other side, and you fall back into a rhythm. Switch, good, switch, good, switch, good. You feel a sense of relief because you've overcome the first adversity of many that you're going to hit from start to finish. Now, this is what it's like to ski with the help of a guide. But more importantly, this is what it's like to rely on someone else to access the things that you love. My name is Stacy Manella. I am a now almost fourth year PhD student in counseling psychology. I'm a sociocultural researcher, a two-time Paralympian, and today I'm going to talk to you a bit about how my experiences and other folks like me can be better together with the help of sighted guides. And I'm going to talk to you about how I've been able to learn to build connection, kindness, and care through these relationships. So I'll start by telling you a bit about myself. I'll talk a little bit about a few stories from my time as an athlete, and then we'll transition to where I am now and why this information is useful for you. So to give you a bit of a background about myself, I was born with achromatopsia, which is a genetic eye condition that affects the photoreceptors in my eyes called cones. On paper, what that means is I am very light sensitive, have very poor visual acuity, and I'm partially colorblind. Just to give you an example of how that shows up in my life, occasionally I wear things that are mismatched. Likely, I will never drive a car unless we get some better technology with self-driving cars. And generally, I just have a pretty hard time seeing, especially when I'm out in very light environments. So for example, when I'm out on the snow and there's the reflection of the white snow coming back at me, that is really hard conditions for me to see in. Now, I was really lucky My parents were very adamant that I get involved in sport from a really early age. And they were really excited about the idea of me being active. So they had me try out a ton of different sports. So I tried karate, I tried kiddie soccer, I tried t-ball. Um, but the one that seemed to stick was skiing. So for a lot of children with disabilities, accessing sport can be really hard because oftentimes programs are not set up to support the needs of folks with disabilities. So I started skiing at the age of 4 at Windham Mountain in upstate New York in the States at the Adaptive Sports Foundation. Now, this was a program that was designed specifically for folks with disabilities to meet the needs of us participating in sport. And that's what really allowed me to get the support that I needed. There's a photo on this slide of me as a toddler skiing in between two sighted guides with a bamboo pole connecting us. And at the time, my parents thought, okay, this is it. This is what our kid will be able to do. We'll be able to ski together, and that will be great. I think it's safe to say that I exceeded their expectations. I have a specific memory of when I realized I needed to sort of shift my trajectory as a skier. I was maybe 10 or 11, and I was skiing in the half pipe with some volunteers from the program. And I was skiing up and down the walls of the half pipe, I guess pretty quickly because I launched myself up and out of the half pipe. And it was sort of in that moment that I started to realize I was scaring my instructors and starting to sort of out ski them, which is why I started to pivot and think about, okay, what could be next for me? I started skiing at some national competitions, at some national camps, and really caught the attention of some coaches, which is what set me out on my journey to ski at 2 Paralympics in Sochi in 2014 and Pyeongchang in 2018. But I couldn't have reached those goals without the support of my sighted guides. So likely many of you know that folks with disabilities can engage in high performance sport with the help of sighted guides. So this is a really unique relationship that I've had the privilege of experiencing myself and also studying in research. But it really transforms sports that we typically understand to be individual sports. So things like alpine and Nordic skiing, cycling, triathlon, into team sports that are very much dependent on communication, trust, and rapport. Now, what many of you have seen of this partnership is probably something like that visualization I brought you through of like what it looks like from start to finish with these guides or with these pairs. What you likely haven't really considered is the relationships that form outside of the field of play. So oftentimes athletes are traveling together, training together, sometimes even living together, which creates a really unique relationship. So I had the opportunity of working with 2 sighted guides throughout the course of my career. Leading up to Sochi, I was working with Kim, and at the time, Kim and I started skiing together when I was around 12, and at the time we used to joke that making the Sochi team was a bit more her dream than mine. But I was young and I really needed the guidance and I really needed to learn what it meant to be an elite athlete, how I needed to show up, what I needed to do. And so Kim stepped in right at the perfect time for me. We skied through Sochi together. And then the second half of my career, I skied with Sadie. And our relationship was completely different. She was actually a bit younger than I was, which is a little wild since we started skiing together when I was 19 and she was 17. And I really needed to step up in this relationship to take more of a leadership role, to set the tone of how we would act as a high performance team and to help us sort of reach our goals. So I'll give you some examples of a few stories that allowed me to sort of grow into these relationships. So when I reflect on my time skiing with Kim, there's a specific race that really stands out to me. So we were skiing up in Kimberley, British Columbia, up in Canada, and we were skiing. It was one of my first downhills ever. So I think I was 15 or 16, I can't really remember, but I was really young in my career and very young in skiing speed. And I was really excited. We had started the run really well. I was skiing really well. Our spacing was good. I was on longer skis because it was a downhill, and so I was getting used to those. I was feeling really good and excited, absorbing all of the terrain and just like having a really good time until we got about 2/3 of the way through the course. There was a big rollover, like a drop off in the terrain, and Kim called it perfectly. But when I went over it, I made a bit of a mistake and I got caught on my inside ski and I ended up like completely crashing, like fully yard sailing. I lost both my skis, I lost both my poles. I rolled down the hill and somersaulted several times. And by the time I like got myself sitting up, I like looked around and was calling for Kim, and Kim was nowhere to be found. Could not find her, was no longer on the hill. So you'll imagine her surprise when she got to the finish line and turned around and I was not there with her. So now Kim's in the finish. I'm sitting on the hill. Luckily, I had a tech that was able to grab me from the side of the hill and ski me down to the finish, and I was safe and it was okay. But what happened is that when I crashed, our mics, so we have Bluetooth mics in our helmets that allow us to communicate effectively. Our mics stopped working. And so our communication completely stopped. And this was a really good learning lesson for us because it showed us that in order for us to have this connection, we need to adjust for the situations. We need to adjust to each other. We need to be concise and clear in how we're communicating. So we leaned into that connection and we were able to refine our communication strategies moving forward. Now, like I said, I skied with Kim through Sochi in 2014. And the second chapter of my career was really more defined by some adversities. So Sadie and we started skiing together leading up to Pyeongchang. And the start of our career together was actually really great. We were skiing really, really well. We skied several World Cups the first year that we came out. We won several of them. We were on the 2017 World Championship podium. We were really excited coming into Pyeongchang, thought we could ski really, really well until things started to go a little bit sideways. So 100 days out from the games, I was skiing a training run and I crashed and I tore my MCL. So I immediately got into rehab mode. I lived at the Olympic Training Center for a little bit and was doing a bunch of physical therapy. I went back to Wyndham, back to my home mountain, started getting back on snow and rehabbing, brought myself back through the season, finally got back on snow sometime in February. We won our first race back, so we were feeling pretty good. And then I crashed again, as is the life of a ski racer, and I got a concussion. Now, this was like 12 days before the games. Our whole entire season had sort of been blown from injuries. And you might be thinking, like, okay, well, you probably adjusted your expectations going into the games. But at the time, now knowing what I know, that would have been the appropriate response. But at the time, I really kind of had my self-worth wrapped up in my performance and in how I was able to perform. And so the result of that is this photo on the top of my slide, which is a photo of Sadie and I sprawled out on our backs on the snow following the Pyeongchang Paralympic Games. We didn't perform in the way that I had wanted. And this was a moment where I really started to question myself. I really started to say, like, what was all of this for? Why am I sacrificing all of this? Like, what am I doing with my life? Was my career even worth it? Is this the last time I'll get to do it? But in taking some time and space, I was really asking myself the wrong questions. I was sort of wrapping my worth as an athlete up in the moments that everyone else gets to see. as opposed to the smaller ones, the acts of kindness, the connection that Sadie and I were able to build with each other, of like showing up for each other, bopping around all over the world, exploring beaches in Korea, hiking in the Alps, offering each other kindness and working towards our goals together. Those were sort of the moments that actually defined who I was as an athlete and continue to show up in who I am as a person. So in figuring this out about myself, I really started to notice some gaps. I started to really critically think about, the systems that our athletes exist in, the cultures of high performance sport that we were speaking about earlier, and recognizing that a lot of the interventions and a lot of the care that we provide is not made for or tailored to folks with disabilities. And that kind of led me down the path I'm on now. I studied sports sociology under the supervision of Andrea Bunden, who you're going to get to hear from next. This lens continues to really shape my work, not only as a researcher, but also as a sports psychology provider. And I'm working towards licensure as a psychologist with a focus on sport and performance. So I have the opportunity to work individually and in groups with a variety of different people, many of whom are athletes and many of whom are athletes with disabilities. Now, I take what I'd like to think of as a very holistic approach to my work. What I mean by that is that I care a lot about who the people I talk with are, and not just their identities as athletes. And so when I start working with people, I describe to them this Venn diagram. So on the left side of the Venn diagram, we can think about mental health and well-being. So that's generally how folks are navigating the world. This is thinking about things like their mood, their personality, symptom management, interpersonal patterns, things like symptoms being things like anxiety or depression, as well as their mindset, so their mental performance. And that's like, how can we optimize someone's mindset so that they can perform to the best of their ability? So this is going to be things like addressing their self-talk or their inner criticism, their confidence, their performance anxiety, how they're relating to coaches and teammates, and generally really considering how context matters here, that we can't pathologize people for reacting to the systems that they're in. And that's where the sociology piece tends to come into how I approach work. Now, I'm really lucky. I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of athletes with disabilities. Specifically, I work for the Sisters in Sports Foundation, which supports women athletes with disabilities getting involved in sport. So a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to work with an athlete, and I was asking her to reflect on how our work has been for her, like what it's been like for her, if it's been effective for her. And she gave me some good feedback. She said that it's really, really nice for her to be able to chat with another person with a disability, someone that understands disability sport and understands to some extent her experience of what it's like navigating the world with a disability. And because she said that I am kind of able to call her out on the things that she does have control over. And so this conversation really got me thinking about representation, how the work that I do, it matters because folks with disabilities deserve to see other people with disabilities offering them care and in these positions. So I have spent some time talking to you about some stories of my experience as a Paralympic athlete. What it's been like for me to learn to build connection with Kim, to offer kindness to Sadie through lots of adversities, and to reimagine what care can look like in the sports psychology and sociocultural space. So why does this matter for you specifically? You all come from different backgrounds and support parasport in a variety of different ways. And so the first piece here is really challenging us to capture the nuance. There's lots of different experiences in parasport, and knowing that these experiences are not homogenous, challenging us to say my experience is very, very different than my guides or than other athletes is really important in how we offer care and address problems. The next piece comes from the wisdom of Andrea, who you're going to get to chat with later, but thinking about stories as a way of challenging us to think and act differently. So we can offer kindness by listening, by leaning into curiosities, by thinking about these stories and allowing those stories to let us think about problems differently. Representation really matters in the way that we offer care. Folks with disabilities deserve to see themselves in the people making decisions about them and offering care for them. And now I know that there are structural barriers that often get in the way of that. And so while that can't be a solution always, it's certainly something we can continue striving for. And in the moments when it's not, really thinking about the importance of context and how cultures are shaping the experiences of these athletes. So understanding the cultures and systems that athletes navigate is essential for how we offer them care. So final takeaways, whether it's in the Athlete Guide partnership or whether it's in any of the jobs that we're doing, we can be stronger when we do things together, when we lean into the strengths that we all have, and we can make changes within these parasport systems that we all feel really passionately about and like want to see succeed through intentional practices of connection, kindness, and care. So thank you very much, and I'm going to pass it along to Andrea.
Thank you very much, Stacy. And I am little bit lonely in the question and answer section here, folks. So feel free to add some questions, and we'll address them in the question period following Andrea's presentation. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Just before I start, can someone confirm you can see my slides?
Yes, I can, Andrea.
Great, thanks. I'm Andrea Bunden. I'm an associate professor at the University of British Columbia in Canada, in Vancouver specifically. I just want to start by, first of all, thanking our past two speakers, Dr. Lowry, Stacy. I've had the pleasure of hearing them speak before, but am always moved in different ways, and you've got me thinking about many things. I'm going to try to pick up on a few of your points, specifically some of the notions that Amanda raised on interdependence, and one of Stacey's final points on why we need to be thinking about the different experiences in parasport and the different maybe roles that people occupy. I also really want to thank Dr. David Howe, a longtime mentor to me, but for organizing the session and for really pushing to have sociocultural matters on the VISTA program. He's been doing this for many years. I think it brings such a needed perspective to our Paralympic community. And on that note, I want to thank some of the VISTA organizers who I know are joining us today. This is my 5th time at VISTA, online or in person, and it's a community that I really value, and I really appreciate how much work has gone into making sure that we have this opportunity to share our work, for people to join us in this very difficult circumstances. Finding a way for us to connect every few years is incredibly important. So thank you for doing that again. I'm going to start by saying I am joining you, like I said, from Vancouver. This is the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territories of the Musqueam people. Our campuses sit on those lands. This is where I live and work and play and do sports and raise my family. And I'm very grateful to the stewards of this land. I have on the screen here a couple images of our campus. The first is a welcome post. It's a post that greets visitors to these territories. It's carved by Brent Sparrow of the Musqueam, and it's of the double-headed serpent. This is part of the creation story of these lands. The serpent travels from the bog to the river, and in doing so creates the river delta. I like to share this post because that river is part of my story too. I came to UBC as a student 20 years ago because I wanted to row on that river. I was a athlete and I was looking for a way to continue my career. and the university sport program provided that. So I came to UBC because I heard they were building a new boathouse on the river. The other image on the screen is of the 2010 Paralympic Games and of the Canadian team at one of the sled hockey competitions. Sled hockey was hosted on our campus. We had new facilities on our campus that were built for the Paralympic Games. And that was when I was a student. And that hosting the Paralympics on our campus was a highly influential event in my own sort of academic journey. And I think really shaped, it was at least part of the reason that I decided to pursue what I do and to make disability sport the focus of my academic career. So what is my relationship to the Paralympic movement and my connection to the topics that Dr. Lowry and Stacey have just discussed? Good question. I sometimes wonder that myself. So everyone here will have gone through some process of registering for VISTA, of signing up and getting the link today. And when you registered, you probably went through this portal, University of Pittsburgh's registration. You clicked register to attend. And then the next question you got, I think maybe after your name, was this one. Have you ever competed in the Paralympic or the Olympic Games? With 3 options: Paralympian, Olympian, and have not competed. I think this was supposed to be a simple registration, but for me, this raises actually a lot of anxiety. I don't know how to answer this question. I have competed at the Paralympics. I've competed at 2 Paralympics. First 2010 here in Vancouver, and then again 2014 in Sochi. So yes, I've competed at the Paralympics. And when I say competed, I mean I trained for several years leading up to each of those games. I was on the race course. I was drug tested. I had a racing bib. And had we crossed the line in the top 3, I would have received a medal. We didn't. Our best finish was 4th. But at the same time, when I look at these options, none of them seem to fit. I'm not a Paralympian. So I clicked, I have not competed. The follow-up: which of the following best describes your connection to the Paralympic movement? Several options here, I don't need to read them all. But once again, there was some ambiguity. I maybe could have collected alumni. Like I said, I did compete. I was a member of Team Canada. But I do understand that option to mean Paralympians. I am a researcher, so scientist could have been an option, but it also, once again, didn't feel quite right. I understand that term to most commonly refer to those working in the hard sciences or the natural sciences. As a sociologist, scientist isn't a term I frequently use to describe myself. So once again, options, and yet I found myself a bit between categories, and ultimately I clicked other. I wonder how many of you sometimes feel this way, that you are part of the Paralympic movement, or that it's a very important part of your lives, professionally or personally, but at the same time, unsure about your relationship to that movement. You're not quite included, although definitely there. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. The many non-disabled others who are absolutely vital to Paralympic sport, but are sometimes between categories, sometimes included, sometimes not included, often just not considered. As has already been mentioned, my entry into parasport, into this work, was as a guide in Nordic skiing. I was a competitive athlete myself, starting at a very young age. I've been competing in rowing since I was about 9 years old, and skiing shortly after. I had a long and if not exactly successful, satisfying career as a competitive athlete. And it was in my late 20s, I was starting to come to terms with, that my own competitive career was ending. And I thought I was okay with that. And I was starting grad school, and I had other things I was being drawn towards. But it was at that moment that I met a woman named Courtney Knight. You can see Courtney Knight on the screen in the top photo, or the center top photo. She's the woman in the center there. And Courtney was, at that time that I met her, she was trying to qualify for the 2010 games. And she invited me to be a part of that journey. We trained together for 4 years, and we did ultimately qualify for Vancouver. She's a local athlete, so we were racing together in front of a home crowd. We had many friends and family and classmates there, and it's something I'll never forget. It was truly just a highlight and an incredible privilege. And after those games, or shortly after those games, Courtney retired. Well, the thing about being a guide is when your athlete retires, you retire. It's not really a decision I made, but she was ready to move on, and I thought that was it. This time I'm truly done. I'm out. And then one of our teammates, Margarita Gorbanova, made the decision she was going to go for another cycle. And she asked me to be her guide just temporarily, just for a few races until she found someone permanent. She never did. That turned into another 4-year stretch with her training and ultimately competing in Sochi. That was also a bit of a homecoming in some ways. Margarita was born in Russia, and although she had moved to Canada as a child, when we competed in Sochi, many of the local spectators recognized her name, Gorbanova, made the connection, and quite frankly, the reception we got there was just unbelievable. I think they were cheering louder for us than for any of the other athletes. And when we were coming into that final stretch in the stadium, the last 200 meters, I knew there was no way that Margarita could hear my calls because I couldn't hear my own voice. It was completely deafening to be in that stadium and in front of that crowd. I think it's really hard to explain what it feels like to be a guide. You're racing, but you're not racing for yourself. This is something that's really unique to parasport. And I think one of the reasons it's so hard to explain is because we don't talk about this. We don't have a language for this. We don't have sort of a set of scripts that I could draw on as a guide, the same way I could draw on certain cultural scripts as an athlete of, success and failure and exhilaration. It was often kind of lonely being a guide in that sense of thinking, who else actually knows what this is like? But at the same time, I guess one of the things I took from those experiences is I felt closer to both of these athletes than I did to my own teammates from my previous sporting career. There was a connection there that was so strong because we were effectively competing as one. We were pursuing the same goals, and we were there to help each other achieve our goals. So what I really value, and what Margarita and Courtney gave me is, a different perspective on sport. I thought I knew sport, said I competed for a couple decades, nationally, internationally. I'd also had 3 degrees in kinesiology, or what you might call sports studies. So sport was familiar ground to me. And then Courtney and Margarita invited me into their worlds and into the Paralympic movement. And honestly, that was wild. It was something that felt both familiar and in other ways very unfamiliar. And that ability to sort of make the familiar strange, that is what sociologists try to do, to see the mundane, to see the familiar thing from an unfamiliar point of view. So it was an incredible privilege. Should also mention that the joke between all of us was that, I was their guide on the trails, but in every other sense, they were my guides. They were the ones inviting me into this world. So that's what I want to talk a bit about today, is these non-disabled others who occupy a sort of in-between space in the Paralympic movement, who are visible in some senses and in some places, but invisible in others. And what we miss when we fail to consider their performances and their contributions to the Paralympic movement. So who are these non-disabled competitors in parasport? We've heard about a few already. Stacey spoke about the guides that she's worked with. Guides are probably the largest group in this category. And I'm going to also specify that I am talking about individuals who are on the field of play. So these are not the same individuals that, for example, Dr. Lowry spoke about, who are perhaps providing care, but not themselves competitors. Although, as you'll see, there is a lot of crossover. And I'm speaking about sort of the roles I know best. But we have guides. Guides are those who are working alongside, competing alongside blind and athletes with low vision. And I believe we've got guides in 4 different sports, although someone's likely to correct me. Alpine skiing, Nordic skiing, we've already discussed. You also have guides in triathlon and in athletics, in the running events. In a similar role, you have pilots. So pilots, once again, are working with blind and VI athletes in the sport of cycling, similar and yet different in the sense that the pilots are actually propelling the bike. I'm sure many of you know this. So let's say even more directly related to the success or the achievement of the athlete, they are themselves on the bike. In bocce, you have sport assistants and ramp assistants. Once again, these are individuals who are on the field of play and they're involved in competition. Depending on the roles, or depending on those 2 categories, they do have different roles, but essentially they are following the directions they're being provided by the athlete they're working with to move ramps, to move equipment, and support the athlete in that way. In swimming, you have tappers. As the name would suggest, their role is to tap the athlete when the athlete is about to approach the wall to signal it's time to turn or that the race is done. 2 others that I think are sometimes overlooked, but in rowing, we have coxswains in the 4 event. These coxswains are most commonly non-disabled others. They steer the boat, but they are also the ones giving calls and executing the race plan. So they are coordinating the action of the rowers in the boat. And they also sometimes serve as a bit of a coach. Not formally, but they are the ones on the water. So they're the ones providing feedback to the athletes and like I said, bringing the whole team together. And then you also have goalkeepers in blind football or blind soccer. These can be individuals, sometimes they're B3 athletes, but most commonly they are sighted goalkeepers. So while these individuals are like perhaps a small minority in each of these sports, when you think about it collectively, there's a lot of them. And yet we hear and see very little of them in the broader context. So where are these non-disabled others visible in parasport? Well, having now been involved in Paralympic sport for 16 years, maybe a bit more, I have seen some changes in this. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen it become a lot more consistent that guides and pilots in particular are included on the podiums. This was previously done in some sports at some competitions, but not for all sports and not all the time. It is a lot more, let's say, common and consistent to see guides' performance being recognized on the podium and also by the media. And I think this is a really important point because the media is how most of the world accesses or knows about Paralympic sport. So for example, I've got a headline here taken from the Canadian media where the guide is listed in the headline alongside the athlete they are guiding. We are also, I think, seeing more athletes talk about their guides and their competition partners. Sometimes they're doing this in the mainstream media when interviewed. Other times they're using their own platforms, so blogs and social media. Here's a blog post or a website post ran by Greek bocce athlete. I'm going to possibly pronounce his name wrong, but Grigoris Polychronidis, where he takes the time to write a post about the role of the ramp operator. And he doesn't just talk about the technicalities of it. You know, he says the athlete is assisted by a ramp operator who remains in the athlete's box, who keeps their back to the court and their eyes averted from the play, and they assist the athlete by moving the ramp. But he also talks a bit about that relationship. He says, you know, this ramp operator is at each and every training session. They're familiar with the athlete. They can't speak to the athlete, but their actions need to complement those of the athlete. So communication, trust becomes critically important. This is some of the things Stacy mentioned when talking about her relationship with guides. He also mentions that the person who takes on this role of ramp operator is both physically close to the athlete and that they're on the field of play, they're next to the athlete, but they're close in that their care for the athlete often surpasses the duties as far as the team is concerned. Stacy hinted at this as well. The guides are often traveling with, rooming with, eating with the athletes. He mentions that the individuals that he's had in this role include his wife, his current ramp operator, but he previously competed with his father and his godfather. He describes them as two beloved persons who are also, you know, competing alongside him. I think that's a point we sometimes miss. Who are these guides, assistants, pilots, and all those other roles? They are frequently family members, spouses, friends. Sometimes they're those things first. Sometimes they become those things after they're after connecting in sport. We have some notable examples of non-disabled others who move between the Paralympic and the Olympic movement. I just have one here. Canadian athlete, Kristen Kitt. I know her because she was a teammate of mine in rowing. We both competed at UBC, but following her university career, she went on to be the coxswain for the Canadian team at 2 Paralympic Games, 2012 and 2016. And following that, she was the coxswain for 2 Canadian Olympic teams. She's not the only example of a crossover athlete that we have, but I want to point out there are pilots and guides and coxswains. Those are probably the 3 categories where this happens. These are athletes with their own competitive careers. They are athletes in their own rights. They're often competing in their own competitions at the same time that they are serving in these roles within Paralympic sport. And yet, I've very rarely seen that mentioned or acknowledged. Now, in each of the previous slides, I've given you examples of where non-disabled competitors are visible or gaining visibility. They are the teammates and the partners of Paralympians, and they are athletes in their own rights. And yet, in other places, they remain invisible. This is the selection document from the Canadian Paranordic team this past year, or actually, this current year, is the selection that will guide the coming season. It's a 50+ page document that has just details and details and details about how the Paranordic team will be selected. What are the criteria athletes need to meet? What are the selection events? Who will make what decisions at what point? What the process for appeals are? I'm sure many of you are familiar with documents like this one. In the entire document, there is one mention of guides. It says the final selection of guides for the 2026 Paralympic Winter Games is made by the High Performance Director in conjunction with Nordique Canada's Paranordic coaches and the athlete. Note the athlete is the last one named as having a voice in this decision. They will be consulted, but their voice will be one of many, and ultimately the decision will be made by the High Performance Director. Now, I pulled up this example from Nordic skiing because it is the sport I'm most familiar with and the documents I'm most familiar with, given that they governed my own role or my own selection. But I have taken a look at other teams both in Canada and in other nations. And I find very similar trends. How guides, assistants, pilots are selected, what rights they have in the process, what responsibilities they have in the process is very inconsistently documented and often not included at all. I'm also a researcher, so of course I turn to the academic literature. I think this is more in the context of the VISTA conference. You know, this is an event that is bringing together scholars and researchers interested in studying parasport. Many of us are pretty well versed in the scholarly literature and the research in this area. And I'm going to challenge you to go find research on specifically these non-disabled partners or about or where they're considered, or even research that mentions them. There is a real gap here. We have 2 pieces that I can find about the athlete-guide relationship, and they were ran by Stacy and myself, based on her master's work. There are other publications looking at athlete-guide relationships. There's a few publications looking at like the experiences of guides, and that is mostly grounded in grassroots or recreational sport. There's a growing body of work there, but not pertaining to, let's say, elite or even competitive sport. The same goes for pilots. There's a few articles on the role of pilots on tandems, but like I said, mostly looking at recreational programming. When you look at like what we might consider the biomechanics, the physiology, sport sciences, broadly speaking, I found one article looking at the biomechanics and aerodynamics of paracycling that does include like consideration for the pilot as being sort of an essential part of that system that's being analyzed. Beyond that, the only mentions I can find are really in passing and usually in the context of papers talking about the barriers to sport participation, where you see like the high cost of equipment and then maybe challenges to finding or retaining guides. Sometimes the guides are actually listed on the list of equipment as if they're another piece of equipment. So they're part of the high cost, but they're never really considered as, like I said, athletes in their own rights or really even as humans in this equation. So why does this matter? I'm not here because I think guides need more recognition in the sense of medals and media attention. I would really hate if that's the message you took from this, that Andrea feels she was not well treated as a guide or that her efforts were not recognized. I don't personally feel hard done by in any sense. I was a member of a team. It was an incredible privilege, and my teammates valued my contributions. I got so much out of those experiences. But I am here because this failure to consider and acknowledge where and how non-disabled others fit matters within the Paralympic movement, because these are the individuals who are ensuring that our athletes, our para-athletes, are properly and adequately supported. As Dr. Lowry eloquently explained, para-athletes require others to be athletes. Bodies that need bodies. It's such a, I think, a beautiful phrase. And when we're not paying attention to these non-disabled others who are the pilots, the guides, the tappers, the coxswains, the goalkeepers, we're not paying attention to those athletes that need support. And specifically those who are most in need of this support in order to pursue their athletic goals. Additionally, I think it matters because there is just a ton of inconsistency and ambiguity in the system. I've shown you that we have examples of these competition partners who are coming to these roles through different paths and who are often serving in different roles simultaneously. Stacy mentioned this a bit, that her first guide, Kim, I believe, was older than her, and that was really valuable in some ways to have someone who had more experience in the sport, who could serve perhaps a bit of a mentorship role, who could help a young athlete navigate the system. Her second guide was younger than her. In fact, her second guide was a minor. That happens more than we acknowledge. Sometimes these individuals are themselves potentially vulnerable in different ways. And yet they're given a huge amount of responsibility and who is looking out for them. There are athletes who are teammates on the field of play. They are sometimes coaches. They are often friends. They are, as I've mentioned, they're athletes in their own right, often competing in other competitions, sometimes as members of that same team. So maybe the coach for the para team is also their coach for the non-para team. So there's power dynamics there. They're frequently family members. And sometimes they are providing personal support or personal care. You know, I have not been asked to change an athlete's catheter, but I have been asked to accompany athletes to drug testing, including athletes that were not the athletes I was guiding. I have spent many hours sitting in medical facilities with an athlete, providing support to them because I was the only person available or because we didn't want to take other team staff away from their job. I have certainly been asked to drive athletes to competition, to rent cars in foreign countries, to cook, assist with laundry. And I don't resent that work in any way, but we need to acknowledge that this is labor that's being done, and we need to make sure it's being done well, and that the people who are doing the work are themselves being cared for. So maybe building on that duty of care that Amanda spoke about. And like I said, it's very rare for individuals to occupy only one of these roles. They're often moving between these roles all the time. So, you know, once again, why does this matter? It is the inconsistencies and the lack of acknowledgement that concern me. Some of the things are, you know, minor, sometimes even kind of funny, like when they forgot, you know, to book me a seat on the plane, or left me stranded at a race course because they checked that the athletes were there but not the guides. Kind of funny, but maybe less funny when I wasn't given a uniform to race until we were almost disqualified because I was not wearing the proper uniform. It's less funny when we consider that I've seen sports that, you know, perform background checks or criminal record checks on their coaches, but don't ask guides to go through the same process and then pair those guides with very young athletes. It's less funny when you're talking about COVID. And I think Amanda made this point well. You know, it was the athletes that needed support that were most directly harmed by the COVID policies, where really, really strict numbers were placed on who could attend, and often failed to consider that athletes don't just need support on the field, they need support off the field of play. It's certainly less funny when we're talking about safe sport. So in Canada here, you know, we have had a decade of conversations about safe sport, of changing policies and structures to try to address issues of safety in sport. And yet, when I look at what's coming out, I see zero mention in the safe sport documents about these individuals. You've got very clear sort of policies in place around athletes and around coaches and managers and other administrative roles, and yet guides, tappers, care workers don't appear anywhere. And like I said, that can make both the athletes, that can put the athletes in a very vulnerable and unsafe position, but it can also put the non-disabled others in very vulnerable and unsafe positions. When we neglect or fail to consider where and how non-disabled others support athletes, we're failing to support the athletes. But the other reason it matters, and I think this comes through in Stacey's stories, these are some of the most important relationships in the athletes' lives. They describe them as incredibly close, important, caring, and often wonderful relationships. So here I have just a few quotes by athletes. I've taken these from things they've either put up on their own websites or shared with the media. But you've got Grigoris Polychronidis, who talks about, now I train every day and compete with my wife, Katrina Polychronidi, who's my sport assistant. We have great chemistry between us, and we use an effective communication code. Usually the person is very close to the athlete. With Katrina, it's something magnificent. It's something wonderful. And the benefit of my game has made it faster. You've got another para-alpine athlete, Mina Fitzpatrick, who's talking about selecting their guide, or like why it's important to have the right guide. Of course, you have to look at their ability to do the job, whether they've got the right skills and whether they'll go fast enough. And you've got to look at how their personality would fit in. But trust is the key part. If you don't have trust in the guide, then you won't have the skill and the speed. They also have to trust I'm going to follow their instructions. She's talking to the BBC in this article about the unsung heroes of the Paralympic movement. I have to say this is one of my favorite partnerships to follow, probably because they're Canadian and they're in Nordic skiing, but Maddie Mullen and Brooke Ailey, they spoke a lot in the lead up to these most recent games in Italy about their partnership and really about how it is a partnership. These are two young athletes who, describe themselves as one team. It's them against the world. And Maddie also speaks about, it's not a you work for me situation. She doesn't think about her guide that way, that the guide is there to serve her. It's a partnership, and it means supporting others beyond the competition. And she talks about how I don't want someone to feel like they only matter when I need help. Brooke has her own goals, and that matters as well. Like I said, I just love watching this partnership because you do really see that interdependence. They are two athletes working so that each can meet their own goals and each sort of live out their athletic careers. So just to conclude, I hope I've made it clear, but it's my position that it's imperative that we make sure there's a place for these non-disabled others in the Paralympic movement, and that we start to acknowledge their contributions so that they can better support athletes, and so that we better support athletes by supporting them. I theorize there's a couple of reasons we don't already do this. I think Amanda pointed to one. We have largely inherited the structures of sport from the non-disabled or the mainstream sport system. We mimic the Olympic system, even when it doesn't work for our purposes. And because these roles don't exist in non-disabled sport, they have been poorly and inadequately considered in Paralympic sport. And what Amanda pointed out was, there is a trend towards integration in many of our countries. Canada certainly we've been in the process of integrating parasport into non-disabled sport for the last 20 plus years. And that's where another tension arises, is both we have not properly accounted for these individuals in our own parasport systems, but then we're also going into systems where, once again, these roles don't exist and therefore are not considered. And then the final point I'd like to make is that, we need to honor these relationships, these partners, and the care they provide, but also the care between partners. When we fail to consider where and how non-disabled others fit in the Paralympics, we also overlook and minimize the important and beautiful relationships that do exist in our sporting practices, the relationality and the interdependence. And quite frankly, this is, in my mind, what makes parasport unique. And this is something worth valuing and preserving. That's my final point. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you all. And I certainly look forward to the questions and conversation that will come next.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I am a little disappointed with the audience because no questions have yet arrived. So as chair and moderator, I will, you know, try to take the first stab at a question for you all. I'm struck by the fact that when we hark back to think about what the Olympics is all about, and Andrea just made the point that the Paralympic movement has sort of mimicked what the Olympic movement has done, and so on and so forth. But when the Paralympic movement does that, I would argue that we go back to the Olympic movement when it was an amateur concern. In professional sports around the globe, tennis players have nutritionists, biomechanists, coaches, and so on that go in tandem with them to the men's or women's tour. A whole collective of individuals that are working with that individual. But we see that individual as independent, self-sustaining, and so on. So this notion of the independent Olympian does not exist. The contemporary Olympian does not get there by themselves, as they may have done in 1896 when the modern Olympics started. So, and tying to that fact that, according to various philosophers, McIntyre in particular, in his book, Dependent Rational Animals, talks about dependency as a human universal. So how do we shift the narrative to say, well, we're just being more explicit about these ideas? And how do we shift the narrative in parasport so that, the IPC, this issue about that I mentioned at the beginning, the Paralympic Village is always smaller than the Olympic Village. And so this issue about not enough accreditations and so on and so forth seems like a bit of a mirage. How do we move beyond that and start to explore, getting dependency as forefronted as human universal and connecting it with a parasport?
Do you have a specific panelist you'd like to respond?
First come, first serve.
I mean, I'll take a stab at it, maybe get started, but I think you're absolutely right. This myth of independence is harmful to all. I mean, and it's I wouldn't say that's like necessarily unique to Olympic or Paralympic sport, but you gave a really good example there. A lot of what we, when we talk about like what is ableism is often an assumption about what things it's okay to get assistance and help with and what things it's not okay to get assistance and help with. So, Stacy mentioned she'll likely never drive a car. I live in Vancouver. I don't need to drive a car. And no one thinks lesser of me if I take the bus or choose not to have a car. They might actually think I'm, doing it for the environment. Good for me. But when they hear that someone can't drive a car, suddenly that's a judgment about someone's ability, their worth. So I think maybe the question is not like, why, is it our job to be more explicit about what the Olympics are doing and to like call out and say like, hey, your athletes are also not independent. Your athletes are there because of the individuals that surround them and because like the decades of science and support they've received. But what we can do is make it more visible in the Paralympics. And I think like that's part of what I'm calling for is like as a first step, we amongst ourselves need to talk more about this, and we need to sort of like talk and do these things in spaces where others can see them. When an athlete's left to just like figure it out on their own, or a team just sort of figures it out on their own, it doesn't put any pressure on our national sport organizations to fix it the next time around. It doesn't, it happened in COVID, or like we saw athletes that couldn't attend because of the rules in place in COVID. I don't know that it led to any changes for Paris. So I think part of it is, it can't stop with talking about it, but I think that's the point of the session today, is to say we need to, at least amongst ourselves, acknowledge that no one gets there alone, and that there's a lot of people doing a lot of work that's going sort of unacknowledged. Maybe the Olympics will learn from us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Amanda or Stacy?
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
was just thinking too, I mean, drawing on both your stories, they're so, I mean, obviously they're not personal cares so much as what I've talked about, but all of that stuff around interdependence. And I think the more that we can highlight the stories of, your experiences, Andrew, of being a guide, and all those beautiful narratives and reflections of the people who've been guides in those high performance spaces, the more we can tell their stories and bring their stories to light and make those connections between Paralympic, Olympic sport, and just like you say, none of us are where we are and who we are without support from others. But I think we need to try and find a way to bring those experiences to light, like really somehow like publish as much as we can, get carer stories, get guide stories, and talk about it from that perspective, and kind of bring that obviously into that academic realm, but also that will then guide the thinking on how those things play out in the big bad world. I think, can we have that power academically to do that? Because through narrative and storytelling, you capture people's hearts. Yeah.
Stacy?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think like if we circle back to the original question, which was like, how do we challenge these narratives? I think the piece that we're missing is that, like from like a Eurocentric lens, to be like a quote unquote successful disabled person is to be independent. And we say like athletes in the Olympic movement, like to speak to what Andrea said, like they get to be dependent because they're dependent in the quote unquote right ways, versus like folks with disabilities have this sense of pressure to be like as independent as possible to not feel burdensome on the systems in which they exist in. And so I think like challenging that piece of the narrative in the Paralympic space, and I think we do that just by like showing up and just by like existing, but really pointing out when, because you see this also, athletes like internalize ableism as well. Like if you talk to a lot of athletes, they will say to you like, oh, well, I just want to be as independent as possible. And that's not necessarily a reflection on their own needs. It's a reflection on like the stories and messages that they've been given. And so I think like challenging those broader narratives around disability and what it means to like be quote unquote successful, because that success doesn't and shouldn't only look like being able to do things on your own.
Good point. Thank you. There is a question. Finally, thanks very much. This is something I don't know the answer to. Is there a formal review process that happens after competitions in relation to these individuals? The group, that was a nice slide that Andrea put up about the guides and then the pilots and so on, the different groups, to highlight successes and failures at a particular games. From your perspective in the Winter Games, Andrea and Stacy, have you ever been asked about the role of the support staff behind the scenes?
Not in my experience. There's never been a formal process. Yeah, in turnover and guides for me, it has always been like a conversation between the two of us, and has always been like personal directions or personal choices moving in opposite directions. Nothing formalized amongst a performance staff.
I think the answer probably is no. And certainly, I mean, you're asking like that could be at a team level, but also like at a games level or something like that. I've never heard of that at a broader level. I'll tell you that informally it does happen, because that example I shared of Nordic Canada's policies on selections for the 2026 games, where it said that the final decision will be in the high performance directors. I'm had you gone back 4 years or maybe 10 years before that, that line wasn't there at all. And in fact, I'm thinking it's because myself and Margarita challenged who has the final decision, her arguing that she had the final decision, and the national team arguing that it was the coach, that they've actually added that line to basically make sure that it's clear that athletes don't have the final decision. So that's not a formal review process, but they certainly learned from the challenge. And the result was to maybe dig in even more and make sure that it was not athletes who had the final say. But what I was going to maybe ask is, well, a couple things. In preparing for today, I think I know parasport pretty well. I was going through and still thinking, am I missing any group here of competition partners, specifically competition partners? And it was a really hard question to answer because I never actually found any place where these individuals are like sort of considered as a single group, in that sense that like you have mention of guides in some sports, and then you've got the tappers here and you've got the coxswains here, but like collectively, do we even have a term for those individuals who are across these sports? So therefore, what would a process to sort of evaluate or even solicit feedback or gather them or have any representation even look like, when I'm not sure they're even considered to be like a population? Whereas we could go, who was it? What was the list of coaches who attended the games? What was the list of, and in fact, even in our like reporting on the games, I often rely on the IPC's own reports for my work, and teasing out, the number of competitors at each games. And David, when you and I were doing some of the work on trying to find out how many women competed at the games, it was sometimes unclear whether or not guys were being counted, whether they're not being counted. Some years they are, some years there aren't. I think it's moving towards maybe more consistency. So I'm not necessarily criticizing the IPC for that, but like, I would love to see that group kind of included as a single category so that we could monitor their involvement over time or connect. But what I was going to ask Stacy, if you don't mind, you did, as part of your master's research, you interviewed athletes and guides from around the world. What are some of the best practices you saw in terms of how maybe guides are identified or recruited or have contracts, as well as like some of the things that athletes and guides spoke of, this is how we want it to work?
Yes, it's a great question, and something I was actually just thinking about as we were talking. Because in my experience, it's interesting, you've seen that you've seen those changes in the contracts, Andrea, but in my experience, it was solely the responsibility of me as an athlete to find a guide. And I imagine that the only reason my sport performance team would have had an issue is if there was a problem that came up. Then they would have wanted to have the say. And I would say that was the experience of most of the folks that I interviewed. Mind you, I did interviews for that study in 2020, so we're talking, it was about 5 years ago now, and as we've talked about, there's been lots of changes in the last 5 years in this movement. Most of the people I spoke with, they signed team contracts in a really similar way that the para athletes did. It was not a specific contract for guides. Most of the people sort of fell into the role similarly to how Andrea described it, in terms of the guides. They kind of fell in the path of the athletes. The athletes needed someone, and that's how they ended up in their roles. There was not formal recruitment options. Recruitment and retention was certainly a stressor and a challenge for the VI athletes, because as Mena sort of pointed out in the quote that you shared, it's hard to find someone that not only has the athletic abilities, but also has a personality that's going to fit and continue to make the sport fun. Because when you're spending that much time with someone, their personality and how they are showing up actually does really matter. And so I'd say there was a little bit of a divide between the athletes and the coaching staff, in terms of the athletes wanted someone that the athletes emphasize the personality and the relationship and the trust more than the performance staff did. The performance staff was like, anyone who's going to sit on the bike and is going to power the bike faster is going to be the one we should choose. So I think that's where we saw the tension in our data. And you can add if you think of anything, Andrea.
And that's interesting. And what about, is there a situation in the care world, Amanda? Is there a situation where, I mean, what's the selection criteria for being a carer? Is it that you're nearest and dearest? Is it, you know, when you get to a high performance parasport event, do people say, well, you know, here's the person that's going to look after you? How does that actually work?
No, it's usually someone who is like involved in your everyday life, who happens to just be with you on the journey. And like support workers in New Zealand, like if I don't want, for example, Andrea to come back, I just ring the company and say, don't send her back. You know what I mean? You've got no standing, there is nothing. It is basically like, you both articulated, it's all about the relationship, and you hold on with your teeth and your nails to people who get you, who have emotional intelligence, who can look after your body, who can enable you to do the things that you want. Like, it's all very well, me having some gorgeous tiny little support worker show up and I'm 80 kilos, and how are you going to get togs on me, and how are you going to get my ass in the pool? So there's physiological constraints, there's personality, there's all of that. And then I end up in a high performance space. It's pretty much like, you're coming with me, this is what we are doing, and next minute they're traveling with you, and it's really random. And there isn't I mean, there's if it's part of an organization, there will be, police checks and stuff to make sure that they're a safe person to travel with the team. But primarily, they're just invisible. No one will speak to them. They're not acknowledged by the rest of the high performance team. They're just your person. So there is like they are invisible, but beyond invisible. So that's, for me, is quite distressing. I don't think that's okay.
Right. Yeah, that's really, really important. And you touched on and Andrea touched on it towards the end, the whole world that's, spinning out of control in a worrying way around issues of safe sport and so on. It's good that Amanda says that, there's safety checks done and so on and so forth. But, dealing with vulnerable people in vulnerable situations and so on, the whole safe sport space has not been properly exposed in the context of parasport. And I wonder if all of you can, starting with either Andrea or Stacy, talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I have spent a bit of time thinking about, and I do have an article with some collaborators coming out very soon in Canadian Disability Sport Journal around safe sport through an ableist lens. But I think one point I'd like to make, I know I've been referring to these individuals as non-disabled others throughout, partially just because that's simple terminology. Like I said, we don't really have a name for this group of people. So I'm calling them the non-disabled others to contrast them from the presumably disabled Paralympians. But that's also like not entirely accurate wording, in the sense that there is nothing saying that these individuals could not have a disability themselves, or other identities that need to be considered in various ways. So, what I mean when I'm saying non-disabled others in this context is, I mean non-classifiable. Like, they are not themselves classifiable and competing in parasport. But without giving specific details about individuals, I've certainly encountered people in these roles who themselves have disabilities, that they're masking or hiding or minimizing because it would raise concerns about their ability to provide the care and support that's needed for their athlete partner. And that, you know, we talked about assumptions and internalized ableism, like that is very much at play here as well. So that to me, I'm linking that to safe sport because I think that's an issue. Anytime someone is not able to fully show up as themselves or feels like they can't have any weakness, that they can't show any signs of weakness, or that they can't ask for the support they need, or that they can't, you know, that becomes a safe sport issue to me. They put themselves, that's the wrong word. They are put in situations where they're not supported, where they're not safe, because they're perhaps, like I said, downplaying their own needs in certain circumstances. So I think that part is completely missed in the safe sport right now. I don't think we sort of safe sport, at least the way it's being discussed in Canada, sort of talks about these like people in power and vulnerable others, without understanding that all of us are in some ways in power, have power in some circumstances, in some situations, and all of us are in some ways vulnerable or put in situations that are dangerous and unsafe. And yeah, so I think that's where I would go. And like, if I was going to say like what needs to happen in safe sport in relation to parasport is, like I said, my own terminology today might not have helped make that case, but I think we do need to understand that these others themselves could be the unsafe ones, and that has to, you know, that has to be considered as well.
Can I'll just add a little bit to that, just in terms of so what was happening here for example, in wheelchair rugby, is that not enough carers were being sent to care for the team, and the same old people were being sent. So these people were getting tired, athletes were actually at risk, the carers themselves were under a huge amount of pressure, and so it wasn't safe sport in the same context, but it still is unsafe for both athletes and carers. And just because that, like you say, that invisible labor wasn't valued by the organizations making those decisions, and obviously it all comes down to funding, because primarily disability sport funding is so limited that the less people you take, you know, the more money, or the less people you take, obviously the less it costs, but the cost is too great for the carers as well as the Paralympics, the athletes themselves. So yeah, safe sport in a different context, you know, physical dangers.
I think that's one of the sorry, Stacey. I think that's one of the problems with the definition of safe sport, is that it's always assumed that because the media highlights are about sexual exploitation and so on and so forth, but safe should be, you know, more broadly defined.
Mm.
And I think that's a problem. Go ahead, Stacey. Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're good. I agree. I don't have too much to add other than to speak to what Andrea said, and to say that like I was skiing with a minor at one point and I have never really considered the implications of what that is, but and also I have some experiences where like the rigidity, so I've been out of this space as an athlete for enough time that I'm not super familiar with the safe sport policies, but in my clinical work I know that sometimes the rigidity of these policies can like really impact how these athletes are able to show up, for example, with like rooming assignments or these types of things, like relatives not being able to room together based off of their gender, or like these rigid rules that don't take into consideration, again, like the nuance of experiences of our folks with disabilities. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. I think there's some interesting overlaps with some of the, you know, issues about, and this is a plug for Thursday at roughly this time. I think it's an hour earlier on Thursday, the classification panel, which is talking about issues of eligibility at both ends of the classification world. And of course, classification is so important, and the bodies that we're talking about here, you know, and one of the reasons that I wanted to bring these stories to the fore is because of their increased invisibility. The athletes, you know, with major impairments and so on, being sort of forced out of Paralympic movement and things like that. Not explicitly, the IPC is not saying this, but what's happening because of this issue about getting accreditation it's causing that to happen.
Mm.
We've got 3 minutes, according to my clock, to run on the session. Is there anything that the panelists are dying to say before we go? Do keep it succinct so that you all get a chance.
Yeah, just thanks again to you, David, for creating the space for this conversation, to the VISTA organizers. I think this is very important perspectives. I'm really grateful to be on this panel with Stacey and Amanda. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Agreed. It's
Right
been a long
back at
time
you.
coming, and I'm excited to chat about it.
Thank you all very much. Again, as a reminder that the next session, I believe, I don't think there's one tomorrow. The next session is Thursday at, I know it's 9 a.m. Eastern time in North America. But I don't know how that translates to how it's been worded in the advertisement. So thank you everyone for attending today. Do feel free to reach out to any of the speakers if you should have questions, if you're a bit shy to add something into the question and answer. No doubt we'd be happy to address your issues. Thank you very much and hope you all have a good rest of the day.